thanks a lot for the introduction. Well, there's a virtual box, and I'm supposed to stay in there. Okay. Raise your hand if I leave the box. Okay. Well, obviously, this topic seems to be of interest for you, probably because we share quite common views on that. And, well, actually, always asked to say what conflicts of interest there are. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Kussner practice, and as such, I also take responsibility to introduce new services to our practice, to our clinic, and we strive to take a 360 view of services we can offer. And so it easily comes that apart from the traditional services, medical, psychotherapeutic, psychiatric services we offer, Kussner practice rests on a strong pillar concerning nutrition and diet. And for many years, I mean, the idea that nutrition has an impact on mental health, you know, this was something, well, a little bit esoteric, and I really want to take this out now of this Ayurveda corner and bring you to the mainstream in research. And you will see that there is a lot of evidence to the topic nutrition, diet, exercise, sleep concerning mental health. Okay. Well, it is quite clear that in recent years, psychopharmacology achieved only mixed results in the treatment of mental disorders. And you know, this real well-known publication by Kirsch, which you see on top, Initial Severity in Antidepressant Benefits, a meta-analysis of data submitted to the FDA, was a very important publication because that what we psychiatrists tend to believe, that we can treat everything with antidepressants, was not so true. And it came out that mostly severe depressions should be treated with antidepressants. So which alternatives do we have today? And there are a lot of non-pharmacological treatment approaches which receive increasing attention. And there is by now what I said, primarily extensive epidemiological evidence for the association between diet quality and mental disorders. And now when I report to you many of these reports, I mean, we have various levels where we have evidence on. There is the highly aggregated level, the epidemiological level, and I always will report from that. And we have a lot of evidence from animal studies. We have fewer evidence on this middle level, so to say, where clinical trials are made, but more or less, we are, with this kind of research, we stand at the forefront of research currently, and there's a lot going on, and there's also something like a nutritional society in psychiatry, which is very active. And we all are aware that the transition from our traditional lifestyles concerning diet, physical activity, and social structures have been linked to increases in depression and also other mental disorders. And common mental disorders are part of an epidemic, showing having a comorbidity between physical and mental ill health, and diet might be a crucial determinant. And it's very important to know, because if we talk to people from affluent countries, they say, well, why should we have deficiencies in nutrition? But there is, in all our countries, a shift toward high, less nutritious foods instead of traditional, more healthy diet. And this is really striking, that many people are both overfed and undernourished. So, many individuals do not meet recommended intakes of brain essential nutrients, including vitamins, zinc, magnesium, and I'll show you others later on. Although there are slight improvements have been detected in dietary intakes of sugar and fats for 10 or 20 years, something like that. The documented intakes of nutrient-rich and fiber-rich vegetable and whole grains are far lower than currently recommended. So these profound changes in dietary habits, along with tobacco use, not enough physical activity, and harmful alcohol and recreational drug use have resulted in an epidemic of ill health. And the mechanism by which nutrition might affect mental health are quite obvious. In particular, the human brain operates at a very high metabolic rate. I'll come to that back later on, and uses a substantial proportion of the total energy and nutrient intake in both structure and function. About 80% of all the energy goes to the brain. So it's reliant on amino acids, fats, vitamins, minerals, trace elements, and dietary habits modulate the functioning of the immune system, which also moderates the risk for depression. And there's also something which is called the antioxidant defense system, which is also implicated in mental disorder, and it also operates with support of nutrient cofactors. Additionally, there are neurotrophic factors, which I don't want to go in detail too much. So what is it in detail? Selected nutrient-based supplements may provide many neurochemicals modulatory activities, and examples of these nutrients are omega-3 fatty acids, adenosylmethionine, and acetylcysteine, zinc, B vitamins, vitamin D. And there have been various clinical investigations which support the usefulness of omega-3 fatty acids for disorders, including bipolar disorder, PTSD, or major depression, and they are indicated in the prevention of psychosis. There was a lot of hope in the prevention of psychosis using omega-3 fatty acids. There was one big study which was quite positive. The second one was not so positive anymore. But just to give you an impression, if you look, I mean, what it is about, it's about what we do is we look at the metabolism, how the neurotransmitters are metabolized in the brain. And you see there the main the main neurotransmitters are dopamine, serotonin, and GABA. And well, I just you see the red ones, all the substances, the nutrients which are necessary to metabolize dopamine. And you can see it's from folic acid, magnesium, vitamins, iron, copper, SAMe, etc. There are various ones, and the same you also find in the metabolism of dopamine, serotonin, sorry. Here you see where it comes from, tryptophan, you know that, and it will be metabolized to melatonin, and you see all these red indicated substances which I'm talking about, which are necessary, you know, to metabolize these neurotransmitters. And again, the same for GABA. So, you know, I mean, there is a close relationship between nutrients and the metabolism of neurotransmitters. So if we take another view on it, it's about epigenetics, nutrition, mental health, and is there a relationship? And this is a good question. I mean, I'm not sure if you are aware what epigenetic in detail means. It's about, we used in the beginning, we used to think about the genome to be very static. This is what we have inherited, something like that, and that's it. But by now we know that the environment impacts on the expression of various genes. And when we talk about the expression of genes, we always talk about the expression or the variation of enzymes which are produced by genes. So if we want to understand the interaction, and this is one of the really contemporary challenges in human genetics, and various epigenetic processes affect the chromosome structure and accessibility of the DNA to the enzymatic machinery that leads to the expression of genes. And one important epigenetic mechanism which appears to underlie the interaction between environment, including diet, and our genome is the chemical modification of the DNA. And the best understood of these modifications is the methylation of cytosine residues in DNA. You know, there are these bases, and cytosine is one of the bases in the DNA. And it's now recognized that the pattern of methylated cytosine throughout our genome, the so-called methylome, can change during the development and in response to environmental cues, often with profound effects on gene expression. And that's what it is about, gene expression, enzymes production. And many dietary constituents may indirectly influence the genomic pathways which methylate DNA. And there's evidence for biochemical links between nutritional equality and mental health. And what you see always on top is what I refer to are mostly reviews on the various topics I've chosen to indicate you that it's not just my opinion. This is something what mostly comes from reviews, what I'm referring to here. So is there a relationship between nutrition in infancy and cognitive performance during adolescence? And it's clear there is a connection between, for example, breastfeeding during infancy, diet quality, and cognitive performance during adolescence. And one of these studies showed that the higher diet score, means representing a better diet quality, was significantly associated with faster reaction time in cognitive performance at age 17. So these are long-lasting effects, and it's of great importance what happens in the first years of your life. I'll come back to that later when I talk about the microbiome, because this is affected and built up during the first years of life as well. So now, what we all are aware of is the impact of glycemic response and glucose regulation. Again, what I said, the brain has a high metabolic rate. Its metabolism is almost entirely restricted to the oxidative utilization of glucose. And this emphasizes extreme dependency of the neural tissue on a stable and adequate supply of glucose. And initially thought that only glucose deprivation under hypoglycemic conditions. And everybody of you, if you're a doctor and if you worked in an emergency service, you might know what a hypoglycemic condition can do to a patient when he or she is referred to emergency service. It primarily appears to be a completely confused person, you know. So it's clear that it really, the glucose, the glycemic condition in your brain is very important on the cognitive function of your brain. But it has become apparent that low-level fluctuations in central availability can affect the neural and consequently the cognitive performance. So although acute rise in blood glucose levels has some short-term improvements of cognitive function, a more stable blood glucose profile, which avoids greater peaks and troughs in circulating glucose, is associated with better cognitive function and a lower risk of cognitive impairment in the long term. You know, this is very important to keep the glucose level in your blood always stable, not having high peaks and troughs, you know, so to keep it stable. So a habitual diet that secures optimal glucose delivery to the brain in the fat and fasting stage should be most advantageous for the maintenance of the cognitive function. There are other things which are important. Example for the potential for primary prevention of Alzheimer's disease. Again, this is an analysis of population-based data. And what you see on the left side are all the risk factors which are associated with the onset of dementia. And probably you are all aware of this. It ranges from diabetes, hypertension, obesity, physical inactivity, depression, smoking, and you're all aware of this. So we do know that around a third of the Alzheimer's disease cases worldwide might be attributable to potentially modifiable risk factors. You know, we are talking about the prevention of dementia. So, might be reduced to improved access to education, use of effective methods targeted at reducing the prevalence of vascular risk factors like physical inactivity, smoking, what I said, hypertension, and obesity. In particular, obesity plays an important role. So Alzheimer's disease are comorbidities of obesity, leading what I said to the theory that vascular impairments may have a role in the development of dementia and psychiatric pathologies. And as a result of these observations, Alzheimer's disease and other dementias are now being thought as potentially preventable diseases. And to cite one study, in a 27-year longitudinal study, obesity in midlife was shown to double the risk of developing dementia at later age. Moreover, while cognitive deficits has been associated with glycemic regulation in diabetes, only in recent years it was observed that cognitive deficits also exist in young, healthy, normal weight individuals with poor glucoregulation. So this exemplifies the need for early rather than late life preventative nutrition measures. You know, just being aware, it's not only the fat ones you have to look at everybody, you know, if they have a poor glucoregulation. And so, I mean, I praise to you good, healthy food. And the question is, why don't we like healthy food? I mean, there's one thing which is called neural signaling of food healthiness. And to make it short, there's one study from colleagues in Zurich, you know, they found an increased activation when food was evaluated in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and a reduced activity of the amygdala. And the amygdala, this is the place where the emotions are processed in the brain. So, see, I mean, it's a cognitive thing to say this is healthy, but it's an emotional thing, you know, to say I love it, I like it. And under stress, we do choose unhealthy food, you know. This was another study done that humans who face self-control dilemmas, which is a stress paradigm, over food reward while undergoing fMRI following stress. And they found that stress increased the influence of immediately rewarding taste attributes on choice and reduced self-control. And these results indicate that stress may compromise self-control decisions by both enhancing the impact of immediately rewarding attributes and reducing the efficacy of regions promoting behaviors that are consistent with long-term goals. And this is something, you know, you can incorporate in your psychotherapy. You always have to be aware, why do people unhealthy food, you know? And this has to do with emotion regulation, this has to do with self-control. So if people have problems with overweight, it's not only to restrict the diet, you know, you have to work with these people psychologically. And there's a strong relationship between the gut and the brain, and everybody knows this by now, the gut-brain axis, etc. And there are the gut microbiota. And there are, you know, there are many relations of the gut with the brain. And one thing we know we all are aware, you know, you all know the saying, I have got a gut feeling, you know, something like this. This is our second brain, which is not very cognitive active, but it gives you a feeling of something. But because it's surrounded, they produce, the gut nervous system also produces neurotransmitters. But there are many, many relationships, and in particular, what you see on the right side, on the left, you can see that prenatal and early life stress modulates the microbial composition of the gut in infants and suggests implication for the vulnerability to mental disorders in children. So, you know, this is something you are not born with. You know, the composition of the microbiome is something which is influenced and composed during the first years of your life. And so this is very important to understand the connections between the microbiome and the microbiota, etc., and the brain, and the vulnerability to mental disorders. And there is something like stress and microbiota, and we know this is associated with the dysregulation of the HPA axis, and we also know that the resolution of depressive systems goes along with the normalization of the HPA axis. And the gut microbiota play a role in progressing the HPA axis early in life and stress reactivity over lifespan. Stress reactivity is something we have to deal with many of our patients, that they're very vulnerable to stress. You know? And again, what I try to clear is to you how, you know, it's not only the brain which is affected, but you see the connection to the gut-brain axis. And there's another important thing, which is well known by now. It's called the leaky gut, which increases the intestinal permeability. And the bacteria directly access both immune cells and neuronal cells of the ENS or ANS, the autonomous nervous system. And there are potential pathways whereby microbiota can influence the CNS, the central nervous system, via immune system, and the autonomous nervous system in presence of stress. You know, so you always see the connections between brain, RNS, CNS, and guts. Leaky gut, I think everybody has heard that. Oh, not? It's easier to say, okay. But it's clear the gut barrier controls flow of molecules between the gastrointestinal tract and the bloodstream. And obviously, it's some compromised integrity of the barrier between, which is termed leaky gut, and is associated with a wide range of intestinal and systematic diseases, including allergies, autoimmune disorders, asthma, inflammatory bowel disorders, IBD, and more speculatively today to mental health. And the consequence of leaky gut is an increase in circulating bacteria-derived, that's a difficult word, lipopolysaccharides, which trigger immunological and inflammatory response. Increased systematic pro-inflammatory cytokines and inflammation suggested causative factors in depression. And you always will see that around mental disorder there are a lot of immune deficiencies, there are inflammation ongoing, and so on. Bacterial translocation across the gut will induce an autoimmune response to the serotonin associated with fatigue. You know, I mean, there has been such a long-standing discussion about what the reasons for fatigue might be, you know, and there's at least one answer. If it's the only answer, I mean, it's questionable, but it's one possible answer. And the associations where affected people have found it concerning fatigue. They're very strict, the idea that fatigue is a mental disorder. You know, they very strictly think this is a physical disorder. But we should not try to separate it, clinical and physical disorders, because they belong quite strictly together. And years ago, there has been the idea that in an analogy to staging, which is done in medicine, for example, with tumor staging, I've heard that we could do that in psychiatry as well. You know, in particular, we could discuss what are the early stages of disorders, which interventions have the potential to offer benefit to this, and the progression of an illness is by no means inevitable. I mean, that's what it is about, and that's what we have to be aware of, you know. We are quite often quite skeptical, and indeed we know from epidemiology that many mental disorders take a chronic course. And we do not really understand why they always take a chronic course, but we try to understand better. And we might have access if we better understand what underlies the various mental disorders. And I'll show you Pat McGorry from Melbourne, Australia, who was one of the first who got into the early intervention research in psychosis. He developed something like the staging in psychiatry we could take. And on the left side, you see the various stages, in analogy to tumors, stage 1, 1, 2, 3, etc. You know that probably. And stage 0 would be non-symptomatic. I hardly can read that. Stage 1, what is it? You can read it. Okay. But it increases. It's very clear, It's also important to know that there is a stage where persons show clear symptoms, but they just remain sub-threshold, below the threshold of a full diagnosis, etc. And you see people like this, people move in this circle with various various symptomatology. You can classify to which stage they belong to. And I just mentioned on the right side, there are various currently not used interventions which could be inflammation or where we should look at. And this is like neuroinflammation, oxidative stress, lipid metabolism, brain structural changes we cannot do anything about, but also the HPA axis, and chronobiology, which mostly means sleep and the importance of sleep. And again, we come to inflammatory and oxidative stress markers. So it is the case, and I said it already, that there is evidence for inflammatory processes in the pathophysiology of major psychiatric disorders. There are elevated levels of cytokines, and this has been known, I don't know, I would say first time I really got aware of this was about 1990. There was a lot of research in inflammatory processes. Elevated levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines appear to precede the development of de novo disorders, suggesting that they play a role in the genesis of these disorders. And there's a consistent body of evidence for an increase in oxidative stress in mood and psychotic disorders, including reduction in brain glutathione levels, changes in antioxidant enzymes, and lipid peroxidation. These are all physiological processes going on. And if we talk about oxidative stress, you might be aware probably the most prominent term associated with oxidative stress are free radicals. So when the cell cannot deal with an excess of oxygen, and this is supposed to be an important factor impacting on various mental disorders, in particular on stress disorders. So evidence that the most psychotropic agents, including mood stabilizers and atypical antipsychotics, they have substantive impacts on oxidative and inflammatory pathways. We tend to think of these substances only exclusively as modulating the neurotransmitters, but they have a much far-reaching, more impact. And there are other agents, pharmacological agents, which primarily have nothing to do with mental disorders, like selective COX-2 blockers, which is a non-steroidal painkiller. You probably have heard that. There were discussions about that. But these COX-2 blockers display potential efficacy in the treatment of bipolar disorders, also in schizophrenia. And the use of statins, used to lower lipids in the blood, which have also anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties associated with lower risks of mood disorders in community studies. And acetylcysteine, which is an expectorant, well known, and it also has antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, shows preclinical and clinical efficacies in bipolar disorders and schizophrenia. And there's currently ongoing a big study, multi-center study in Germany about using acetylcysteine as an add-on in the treatment of schizophrenia. Even aspirin appeared to reduce the symptoms of schizophrenia in a placebo-controlled trial and was linked to less progression of disease in bipolar disorder. And in a pharmacoepidemiological study, minocycline, which is an antibiotic, which has also antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, has potential in diverse illness models for mental disorders. So I've mentioned the name fatty acid markers, which seem to be important. Phospholipids are main structural elements of all cell membranes. And you all have heard that, because it's written in the newspapers every day, polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are supposed to be, I don't know, do you say PUFAs or something like that? Sounds a little bit strange. Play a central role in a broad range of physiological function, signal transduction, receptor sensitivity. And they are precursors which mediate inflammatory response, and they have a neuroprotective effect. PUFAs are essential fatty acids. Essential means since humans are unable to synthesize them de novo, they must be sourced in diet. And a typical Western diet contains low levels of anti-inflammatory omega-3 fatty acids and high levels of pro-inflammatory omega-6 fatty acids and saturated and other saturated fatty acids, leading to an increased production of pro-inflammatory icosanoids. This imbalance has pathological consequences and is a promoter of chronic disease. See, I always try to say it's not just diet, it's not just healthy food. We have to be aware what the various nutrients, micronutrients, what their impact is in human physiology. And in relation to mental health, omega-3 unsaturated fatty acids may play a role in the pathogenesis of major affective and psychotic disorders. Patterns of these fatty acids alterations are not specific to depression, but are also found in other conditions accompanied by increased oxidative stress. We talked about it. Alzheimer's disease, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and during normal aging. Well, a study in a cohort of more than 30,000 women from the general population, an epidemiological study, found relationship between dietary intake of fish, the richest dietary source of unsaturated fatty acids, and vitamin D, and psychotic-like symptoms. Psychotic-like symptoms are symptoms below the threshold of psychosis, and they are quite common in populations. Something between 5 and 10% of the population suffers from psychotic-like experiences. And there's also evidence that fatty acid deficits may be present during the early stages of psychotic disorders. I talked about that. Oops. So let's come to sleep. It's a characteristic of the onset of most psychiatric disorders is a disruption of sleep, often accompanied by shifts in the sleep-wake cycle. And shortened sleep duration appears to be a risk factor to the onset of common forms of psychological distress. Well, we all know that. Polysomnographic studies have received relatively little attention in recent years because of lack of diagnostic specificity, meaning we see changes in polysomnography, but we cannot really say what it is specific for, what kind of mental disorders it would indicate. But there appear to be distinct sleep signatures. which is a field of research currently, which consistent reduction in slow wave sleep and schizophrenia and shortened rapid eye movement latency and increases in REM, again rapid eye movement density in depression. You know, it's not only that people sleep badly, the architecture, the sleep architecture is severely disturbed. And you know, this is something many people suffer from. This is a study we recently published about sleep problems in the general population of persons aged 20 to 40, and to say roughly 1/4, 25% suffers from sleep problems. The majority, 2/3, describe what we call sleep misperceptions, which like difficulties in initiating sleep, frequent awakening during the night, and to a lesser degree, early awakening. And there are also a core group of people with severe insomnia, and this is also very typical. Difficulties to get up in the morning, initiating sleep, frequent awakening, early awakening, anxiety during the night, and nightmares. And, you know, that is what we call severe insomnia. And but just the one who complains sleep misperceptions also are the one who suffer from stress disorders. And one of the first questions when you see a patient might be, do you have sleep problems? You know, and this is very important, even if they cannot describe in detail why they don't feel well, but they most of the time can tell you in detail that they don't sleep well, you know. And so this is very important if you look at the onset. And if we go to diet, sleep, exercise, you know, and something like a circle. I'll come back to exercise later on. But it's like a circle, because you can go in this direction, you can go in the other direction, you know, because all is related with each other, you know, like HPA axis, you know, like neurotransmitters imbalances. So you see, so this is obviously all related with each other. And before I go to exercise, I want to go in more detail what the relationship is between diet and depression. And because there have been many studies on that. This is again a review by Lopresti, a review of lifestyle factors which contribute to important pathways associated with major depression. And what you can see is that, which has been confirmed in prospective and epidemiological study, that the consumption of fish, vegetable, olive oil, cereals correlated negatively with the severity of depressive symptoms. And the adherence to Mediterranean diet, comprising high levels of vegetable, fruit, nuts, cereals, vegetable, fish, moderate alcohol intake, and low consumption of meat or meat products and whole fat dairy, was protective against the development of depression. You know, again, what I want to say, if we look on an epidemiological level on that, and we see there are connections, obviously, between various kinds of diets and the well-being, the mental well-being of people. At that point, in epidemiological studies, you cannot answer really causal relationship, but you see there is a relationship. On the other side, depressive symptoms are positively associated with the consumption of sweets, and similarly high intake of fast food like hamburgers, sausages, pizza, processed pastries, muffins, donuts, croissant, all what we love, are associated with increased risks of depression up to 6 years later. I mean, it's not only the question, are people depressed? You know, we all are depressed when we have eaten too much, and you know, and feel tomorrow it will be different. You know, but this is not what I mean. I mean, this is a long-term observation where you can see that people for many years later have a higher risk for depression. You know, so diet and its effect on inflammation. There's strong evidence. When sometimes
take words like this: strong, less strong, moderate, I mean, this comes out if you see a lot of studies which go in a certain direction but are not very clear, then you say moderate evidence or stronger evidence, things like that. But there's strong evidence in human studies that adherence to a Mediterranean diet is associated with reduced inflammatory markers. And you remember I was talking over and over about these processes, inflammatory processes in depression. And when you see that certain kind of diets lower the inflammatory markers, it can be important. And in a study on people with metabolic syndrome, 5 weeks on a Mediterranean diet corresponded with lowered plasma C-reactive protein, CRP, you know that, and an arbitrary inflammatory score was included. It included various interleukins, leukins, I don't know how you pronounce it, etc. It was clear that the C-reactive protein levels were lower in an elderly population on a Mediterranean diet compared to a standard healthy diet, comprising high intake of fruits, low consumption of eggs, spirits, liquors, meats such as bacon, pork, lamb, and sausages. So fatty acids were able to partly inhibit a number of aspects, unsaturated, there is missing a word, of aspects of inflammation. And again, we also know that diet has an effect on oxidative stress, given the crucial role that diet plays in antioxidant intake. Diet quality also influences levels of oxidative stress. In obese adults with metabolic syndrome, reducing energy intake by 2,000 kilojoule, mainly via carbohydrate restriction, was associated with decreased oxidative stress and increased levels of antioxidant markers. And again, Mediterranean diet is associated with increased circulating plasma, antioxidant levels, and decreased oxidative stress. So, but the people living in the Mediterranean area, they also like pizza. So, again, sleep, it's not just the regulation of sleep. We have to be aware that sleep has an impact on the inflammation, on oxidative stress, and the HPA axis. Again, well, I don't know if I want to read this all, but this is clear, like sleep difficulties increase inflammatory mediators. Conversely, elevated inflammatory molecules heighten the risk of sleep problems. And you see all the time, that's what I really want to make clear in my presentation, how physiological processes are related and interconnected with all kinds of mental disorders. So when you see a person with a mental disorder, you do not only look at the mental problems of this person, you always have to be clear or should investigate in processes like inflammation, oxidative stress, etc., etc. Relationship between exercise and depression. And there are many investigations into sedentary behaviors, largely confirmed the positive relationship with depression. And depression is commonly associated with low levels of physical activity, and studies do not necessarily confirm causation, but consistent relationship does exist. In adults, active lifestyle associated with reduced depressive symptoms, we have overweight, obese adults, and they have a reduced risk of depression associated when we had moderate to vigorous intensity of physical activity and decreasing sedentary time. So chase your patients out. I don't know how many of you did ever a walk with your patients? Okay, not too many. Might be the good idea for your sake as well, by the way. But you see, last not least, in the longitudinal study over 9,000 people, regular physical activity was associated with reduced likelihood of depressive symptoms at follow-up. So you see, many of the studies I'm presenting here, they show in some way correlations, you know. Sometimes we cannot definitely answer what has caused what, you know. But it seems quite clear that, like also physical activity is beneficial for depressed patients. But possibly you only get these people out to move, you know, when they are getting better. I don't know. Exercise, its effect on inflammation, and okay, something went wrong here. And this is also, see that exercise, you know, moving, is followed by an increase in anti-inflammatory cytokines. Now, I've talked a lot about the cytokines, and decreased production of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And exercise results in an upregulation of antioxidant enzymes. Thus, exercise itself can be considered an antioxidant. In a study on female adolescents with mild to moderate depression, 8 weeks on an exercise regimen improved depressive symptoms and was associated with reductions in 24 hours urinary cortisol levels, which is the connection to the HPA axis, which I was talking about so much. So, I mean, we are coming to a point which is more an ethical, less a medical or whatever question, which is called food sovereignty. Well, food sovereignty has been defined as the right of people to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agriculture systems. And this doesn't happen in most part of our world, you know. And if we talk about human health, it is an implied component of this definition through the principle of healthy food. And there should be more concerted effort to generate new empirical evidence on the health implications of these domains of food sovereignty, which are urgently needed. And I also feel that I'm traveling a lot, and I do see it's not only shopping has been standardized all over the world, but food has been standardized all over the world. I'm not to name any of the companies where you get hamburgers, but from Beijing to I don't know where, you know, you can get the same food all the time. And it's not what we would call the healthy food. So what are the conclusions? Well, the importance of lifestyle factors such as diet, exercise, sleep are generally acknowledged in research literature. The mechanism of their potential influence are often not fully understood. And exercise and sleep can influence several physiological pathways, and a bidirectional relationship likely exists between several mental disorders and these lifestyle factors. And a multitude of other lifestyle influences may also be important. Chronic stress, social influences, mental, physical effects associated with medical diseases. I assume you are aware that the life expectancy of mentally ill persons is reduced between 10 and 20 years. So you see that we don't focus on medical problems of mentally ill and don't see the relationship between medical and mental problems and what we are here. And we do know the impact of alcohol and other drug use, chronic pain, or even exposure to sunlight or not sunlight, you know, might be important. And remember, vitamin D was something which is needed for the synthesis of neurotransmitters as well. And their basic intervention comprising attention towards one cause or one biochemical mechanism, so we are not only targeting one neurotransmitter disturbance or something, and this, if we do that, this makes the goal of remission or recovery less likely. And this is what I try to intend with my presentation here, to make clear to you that what we need for our patients is a whole bundle of various approaches
And they are not restricted to pharmacological approaches. They are not restricted to psychotherapeutic approaches. You see, today the confrontation is almost between psychopharmacology and psychotherapy. There's a lot more in between and around that. And if we want to support the recovery of our patients, we should really consider many more aspects of their lives and how they live. And I think that has been it. Thanks for your attention. I'm afraid we have lots of time for questions. But the ones who are really tired, because I would not mind if you want to leave now. Okay.
With our current statistical methods of diagnosing conditions, how would the staging system work that you described in a country, say, like the UK with the NHS, where you need a diagnosis to progress with treatment, but in the model that was described there with the staging, you'd be unable to access treatment until you were symptomatic.
Right.
As you were saying, actually makes it more difficult to treat.
Okay. Well, I would assume that even in the NHS, people are allowed to contact a doctor if they subjectively suffer. Oh, is that right? I mean, that would be the first consultation, something like that, you know. And during these consultations, I mean, you have the possibility clinically to diagnose, you know, if they are still in a sub-threshold state, you know. And nothing prevents you to give some tips, make some proposals what could improve their state or their condition up to that. But, you know, well, I live in Switzerland, and this is a very highly developed healthcare system, and some would say a luxury healthcare systems. And in Switzerland, actually, I don't know one doctor who would ask for a diagnosis. You know, if a person suffers, you know, they treat these persons and they make a diagnosis to it. Okay. Yes,
I have a question about childhood development and if somebody is not breastfeed fed and
Yeah.
then they go on to have receive poor nutrition for whatever reason, is there any data on increased depression in new generations now?
Well, there's data that there's an increased vulnerability to all kinds of mental disorders, you know, and we must be aware that raising a child is a great responsibility, not in a sense that you make everything right, but the framework in which a child is raised, you know, it's very important. And I mean, we do know about the importance of the first years. This is also like mother-child eye contact, for example. This is a very important indicator. For example, you know, stimulating a baby. You know, these are all very, what I said, diet, nutrition is also for a child one factor. It can be an important factor, but it's embedded in a whole bunch of various factors. You know, it goes on if a child gets bullied in kindergarten or bullied in school. You know, and then sometimes, you know, things get more complicated. I'm not sure if you all are aware that many mental disorders start at the age of 10, like OCD. You know, their anxiety quite often starts at the age of 12. You know, there are many first onset psychotic disorders at the age of 15, 16. You know, and this sometimes gets complicated by substance use. You know, so. My teacher, Schulangst, always told me, you know, alcohol is the most wonderful tranquilizer you can legally have access to, you know. And it is. I mean, many people use alcohol to to cover their social anxiety, for example, you know. But this is, okay. Yes, please?
There's a lot of science that's coming out to corroborate what you're saying. However, the problem is it's not getting, as far as I can see, into mainstream medicine. It's not getting into, treatment for mental health disorders or even addiction treatment. So there are very few rehab centers and addiction treatment centers around the world that actually incorporate the biochemistry aspect. And they look at your gut and your nutrition and your hormones and all the things that you mentioned. And so in your view, I know this is changing, and I know that you stuff you guys do this, but I mean stuff has a very high price tag. And so what's your view long term in terms of the likelihood of this actually changing in the way mental health and addiction is treated in practice?
Well, I mean, when we're talking about Kutzner practice, I would say with some regard, we are on the forefront. But this is nothing exclusive. Everybody of you who is treating patients can incorporate these ideas in your treatment. What stops you? Looking at a certain kind of diet, things like that, doing exercising and things like that. This does not cost a lot, It costs a lot of work, indeed, but not in the sense that the substance is your knowledge about it, and you have to bring it to the patient. And practically everybody can do that, more or less, Yes, please.
I've often heard with low-income families that when it is suggested to them that they need a healthy diet, first of all, they're not open to the idea, and they so often say, but it costs so much more.
Which is true.
Fresh vegetables rather than pizza
Mm-hmm.
and fish fingers. So that is a big obstacle, actually.
I do understand. You're perfectly right. I mean, this is an obstacle. We do know that because lower classes have poor diet, poor quality diet, and they have it because it is cheap. It's and why is it cheap? Because it comes from mass production with a lot of pesticides and things like that. I mean, this is such a mixture of things, and all in all, we all are aware that people from lower classes have a lower life expectancy than most of us, but mostly we are not aware that this is also associated with less good well-being, mental health well-being. This is quite new, I would say. That it affects your mental health as well, the food. And what to say? I mean, except you are right. Yes, please.
There's been quite a lot of coverage on the use of antibiotics and how they affect the microbiome. And I wonder whether there is a correlation between the overuse of antibiotics and perhaps mental health, whether that affects the gut and the way.
Yes, you said microbiotics, yeah? Microbiota.
I said antibiotics.
Antibiotics, yeah. Well, there was, okay. Yeah. I mean, antibiotics can significantly change the microbiome because it destroys a lot of the bacteria in the. I mean, if I'm right, I think there are. I mean, this is the biggest population, the microbiome, the biggest organ in your body. If I'm right, I think this is something like 120 billion cells. And the composition of the microbiome is extremely important for your functioning. That it also affects your mental health is something quite new, more or less new, but I mean, it's obvious that it impacts on your physiological functioning. And we know that everybody who has been forced to use antibiotics, what it does to your guts. Feeling nausea, vomiting,
these are more acute effects, but you know, they are much longer lasting effects until your guts regenerate, you know, if they do. And there has been something which I'm not really happy with, because we don't really know, not we, but there are people who currently do that for very restricted illnesses, gut illnesses, what is called a stool transplantation. You know, I mean, this is an offer which is currently used in some way, and to be honest, I'm not sure what we are doing when we are doing something like that. You know, we don't know the effects. What it is. Yes, please. Well, under conclusions, I said diet, exercise, sleep, you know, are significant elements in the recovery, but they are elements, you know, and as a social psychiatrist, I would say that the kind of person you right now described, you know, the first steps you go is to do something about the social environment this person is living in before you care about Mediterranean diet, you know. I mean, get him away from the street, you know, and not provide him with some Mediterranean food. You know, that's not exactly, yeah. But it's always, you know, well, I don't, you're perfectly right. I mean, there are many more predominant features of mental problems, substance use problems, where I would say they don't care about what I was talking about. But after all, the kind of person you were describing, if you break it down, are relatively few compared to the majority of the people. And if I come to another topic, which I quite often present to, is the ethics of mental health care. And we have always believed that we have to care primarily for the most severely ill. And on the other side, we always are surprised that in healthcare in general, mental health very often has no priority. And we wonder why. And I think the answer is sometimes quite easy. It's for a simple reason, because most people say, I'm not affected. Right? So, which is not true, by the way. I mean, we know that about 50% of the population suffer from a mental disorder during their life. But it's not incorporated of their understanding of health, you know. And this is why I say we also have to care for all the people with light depression, you know, anxiety disorders, which are mostly not in our focus, at least in social psychiatry, right? So, but I tell you, an anxiety disorder can be extremely disabling. OCD, anyway, I mean, this is a disabling disease, yeah, you know. But there is, and this is what we have to be aware of, that all mental disorders are always on a continuum. You know, we don't have a clear separation between healthy and pathology. We know that from all epidemiological studies. If we look at the distributions of symptoms, we don't see a
discontinuity, meaning there is a clear separation where we can say this is illness, this is health. This is not the case. So if we agree that mental illness is always on a continuum, you know, we also, and this was the question a young colleague was asking in the beginning, what are we doing with subthreshold disorders, you know? And we have to be aware that mental disorders are, the classification of mental disorders is in a way artificial. We agree on that, you know? When the DSM-6 comes out, we agree on something else, you know? And there will be people who had no illness all of a sudden will be ill, and vice versa, you know? So, but this is actually not what interests us, you know, and it is clear. But when I'm talking about this, honestly, I would not try to cure a severely depressed person exclusively with diet, to make this clear, right? But I do see that it can be helpful, you know, for various reasons, in particular in the beginning stages. And it can be preventive and can change the life of people if you continue to look on your diet, to be careful about yourself, to do physical exercise and things like that, you know. Yes, please, Dean.
Thank you for your talk, Professor. I was going to ask you, what should I eat? But I thought that was maybe a bit too broad-ranging. So if I could change one habit, or if there's one ingredient that stood out from all of this research, something we could all leave here and go, right, I'm going to have that as my side with my dinner, what would it be?
Well, I know you are underweight, Dean, and I would recommend chips, you know, for you. Okay.
It seems to me, so I'm a nutritionist, and it seems to me that you talk about the gut-brain connection. Most people hear as psychiatrists, psychologists talking about the brain. So your question about how do you implement it, it seems to me that the solution for the future goes across referrals, so everybody working together. You know, and so as a nutritionist, I work with, I don't really work with addiction, I work with anxiety, but for instance, with your urine test for pyroluria, and one of the symptoms of this is addictive personality, it's addictive tendencies. And so in a simple urine test, and the cure treatment is just B6 and zinc, you know, and so you wouldn't really be worried about the addict finding a Mediterranean meal, but actually just supplementing them to make their tendencies and their addiction, you know, less extreme, while they're getting help from somebody else in that approach.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that would be the most holistic approach going forward.
Maybe I should have
Well, actually, I'm very much in favor to work together with nutritionists, you know. I mean, this is essential because, after all, I'm an amateur concerning nutrition, you know. I'm a researcher and I'm in that, but I don't really know about the very much details, you know, and that's very important. But I also know how frustrating sometimes the work of nutritionist is, you know, because you know the right things, but people don't care. You know, and that's really problematic, you know. But when again, if we try to close the circle again, I mean, when you're giving advice, the goals are very often very far-reaching. You know, like reducing vascular risks or something like that. You know, mental illness is much more immediate to the people than telling the people when you are 80 and you will have vascular problems or something like that, you know. But this is immediate, and they can more or less experience an improvement quite immediately. You have to make the connection to it, yeah?
There's also a whole field now that's growing called integrative mental health and functional medicine psychiatry, which is
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, there are big companies which are interested in this approach as well. You know, like Nestle recently invested about 100 million euros to set up a functional food department, you know. Right. Yes,
May
please.
I ask you, do you have any comments or observations about caffeine?
Except that I'm using it a lot myself.
You don't observe any negative consequences?
Oh, sure. I mean, the problem with nicotine caffeine is that it very shortly improves your cognitive functions. You know, we all know that. And this is, while the addicted smokers, if you sit at your desk and work, you know, and you get stuck, you say, now I need a cigarette or something like this. And it does improve for a few moments your cognitive functioning. And this is what makes us addicted to caffeine and nicotine, you know, because they improve cognitive function, and we like that, you know. And it's a legal way to improve your functioning. Yeah.
Some treatment centers disallow
Oh, no.
caffeine. What do you do?
Most of the time we have bigger problems. But in general, this is correct, you know. I mean, to lead an independent life also means not to be dependent on caffeine, right? But this would be incorporated in a, you know. I mean, if a person comes to you with substantial problems and you get started and said, now we stop your coffee, you know, she won't like you. I mean, this is one of the problems. Well, I'm now in psychiatry for almost 40 years. And there's one continuous observation over 40 years. Patients do not like us. And I always wonder why. You know, because we are so helpful. But we make proposals to them which most of the time lead to a significant change in their life, and for good reason. They're addicts for good reasons. They're depressed or whatever they are, you know, but they've found in their life a balance to live in a way with their symptoms and the symptomatology, and even if it's dysfunctional, it's very difficult to give it up, whatever you have. And this is the problem. And if we talk about addiction, it's not only stopping the addiction. You have to replace it with something joyful. You know, you have to offer something instead. You know, if it's only about giving up something, it doesn't work. You know, why should people give something up and have nothing to replace it with? You know. Yes, please.
So one thing which I've worked on before, which may help for people who have particularly poor diets, is positive, with poor mental health and poor diet, is positive exposure to preparing their own food.
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of like working across the sector is maybe seeking out groups or seeking out cooking classes, so that people actually have the exposure. Because a lot of the men who I've worked with are severely depressed and never cooked their own meals by the time they're like 40. So yeah, that's maybe another thing.
How right you are. You need to have expectations for your life. And even if I'm now associated with Krishna practice, most of my professional life I spent with the very poor. And it was always clear that you need to give those people hope. And by the way, this refers to all patients, giving hope, right? But particularly these people who neglect everything. Why should they get up in the morning? For what reason? Why should they dress properly? Why should they take a shower? Why should they prepare a meal? You know, why should they stop smoking? You know, it was. I do remember decades ago. I spent some time here at the IOP with Julian Leff, which some of you still might know, and he said, "Well, I mean, how can you take away a cigarette from a schizophrenic patient? Does it bring this person anywhere? No, it doesn't. You know, you propose a model of health which does not help this person, and this refers to everything. The people need to sense that what you have to offer to them is helpful. You know, and this is what makes psychiatry and psychology and psychotherapy so difficult, because these people suffer immediately, have difficulties to give up their dysfunctional life, and you have to replace it with something else. You know, and this is the same. Show people to prepare a meal. You know, it can be joyful. You know.
How important are hormones in this whole mix?
Pardon?
How important are hormones in this whole mix?
Hormones are.
Especially in one of the sessions earlier this morning, talking about mental health in the ER and how predominantly women are
What is ER? Could you?
Emergency room, and how it predominantly women, people persistently turning up at the ER, visiting 2 or 3 times a month, and how a high percentage of these people that do that are with no physical symptoms, but they are women, and I was your hormones. I'm interested in that, in this balance.
I mean, there are high users of ERs, you know, and mostly they come for other than health reasons. This is difficult to say. Hormones always play a big role. We know that for decades, you know, and this is another thing. When we see our patients suffering from some mental disorders, we rarely look at their hormones. So, but it's so obvious quite often, you know. Thyroid hormones or things that, you know, females' hormones, menopause, you know, you name it. You know, there are so many physiological processes, and hormones are naturally one of these processes which are really important, right?
You know, one thing I wanted to mention, for helping people, one thing I noticed is when you get to find that balance, and we do that as a team, to make the positive results of giving up the long cigarette or coffee, drug of choice, more beneficial to the person's life than the drug. That's where I see that they grab on it, and then it's a very positive engine. It's a positive change.
Right.
You know, we also see this being used in a negative way, like when people start to lose weight and they get on the balance every morning, and you know, and they see a couple of 200 grams less, whatever it is, it can become quite addictive as well. So the reward is great, right? I mean, who doesn't feel better if they're trying to lose weight when they get on the balance? They're half a kilo skinnier. So, but what I do want to mention is like not snack. For example, if you can have a continuous, I've seen working for many people, you have a continuous length of concentration without feeling hungry, without worrying about it. After you get to that point, then the rewards you get are so powerful that it does overcome and it does fulfill what you mentioned before, which is the pleasure of that dysfunction.
Well, actually, I mean, what you say, losing weight can become addictive as well, and I do and still do treat mostly young women whose problems started as a teenager when they were a little bit overweight, you know, and try to lose weight, and then they get stuck with the idea of losing weight, you know, and overly watching their weight and things like this, you know. That's, so, and by the way, in this regard, you see that all these mental disorders mostly are embedded in a social structure. I mean, like talking about eating disorders means you must have an idea what a young girl, a young woman has to look like, you know. And this is not the same all over the world. So, you know, so it's very clear that all we do is not independent. It's not only physiological processes. It's not only brain metabolism. You know, it's always embedded in a social structure, you know, and in a culture as well. Yes, please.
Yes, Professor, thank you very much. I've been fascinated by what you're saying. I've been listening to you for years. I'm not an academic, but I do have a question. And that is, where does this all go? We've talked about what to do if someone comes for treatment, how you know, what models to engage in, but what kind of preventative measures can we engage in so that in 20, 30 years' time, our children and our children's children don't fall into the slippery slope of, you know, becoming substance abusers or alcoholics? Who do we hold accountable? Because I suspect there are many different moving parts. And you mentioned Nestle. You know, 100 million is nice enough. So, I mean, they're probably one of the 10 biggest companies in the world, and no doubt responsible for the diet problems that the world actually has. How do we manage this? How do we facilitate the process where it's not just about the therapists and the psychiatrists and the mental health experts responsible? How do we engage the world to kind of sort this out for 20, 30 years down the line?
Very good question. I mean, the thing is, well, 3 or 4 years ago, I published a book of prevention on mental disorders. And to be honest, at that time, I was not an expert on prevention, but then I found out how many preventive approaches, effective approaches there are. There are many, many, many. And they all start in childhood. They go to kindergarten, they go to school, you know. I mean, how can we build strong personalities? And this mostly happens during the first 15, 20 years of life. And this is something, a burden you carry around with you with the rest of your life. And we could invest so much in prevention, and we do know so much already. But unfortunately, almost nobody is interested in it. You know, as therapists, we live from the fact that people don't get better. You know, actually, if we were effective, the rate of mental disorder should decrease, but it doesn't. You know? So we are partly responsible also to think in prevention. And when I talk about prevention, I don't mean secondary or tertiary prevention or something. I mean really primary prevention. You know? And if we accept that all mental disorders result from an interaction of your genetic equipment and the environment, then we know today when we change the environment, and I said it right in the beginning, when we change the environment, we can change the gene expression. It's not so to say we cannot do anything about the genes. That's us, you know, and we have to adapt the environment. No, if we change the environment, we change the gene expression, right? So this is an interaction, and a necessary interaction, where we take responsibility. We all do, you know?
That would require some shift, really, because I think as a society, we tend to focus on how to fix things, how to remember
you're right. Yeah.
after the event.
Right. Yeah, prevention is not paid for. Well, I see, as a gift to you, 3 minutes early.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.